This is 2 in a row. People are going to think we're trying to hide something.
Yep. The optics are not good for someone who may be cynical in our community.
I'm sorry, it's going now.
Cynics in Sherwood?
Yeah, good thing we don't have that.
Hey,
there it is.
I see it.
Thanks, Brad.
Yeah, good
Thank
job.
you, Brad.
Thank you.
All right, so we're 20 minutes late, but we're going to start our work session for today, November 12th, 2020. It's a continuation of our discussion on recreational marijuana as it passed in the November election. And we need to look at code cleanup, the taxes, and anything else that folks want to talk about. We chatted about this on Tuesday the 10th, but we got our YouTube broadcast interrupted, and so we recessed or closed the meeting to continue it today. We already talked about taxes, and then we're in code ordinance cleanup discussions. We talked about hours of operation, moving that out of land use code. We talked about prohibiting drive-in, drive-throughs. I think we more or less model what is allowed with alcohol, which is none of those things. And then what else, Josh?
So the two takeaways I got in terms of action items from the last session was to, as you said, move the hours of operation out of the land use code, and that we are going to pursue contracting with the Department of Revenue for the local tax collection.
Right.
So those are the two items I had. And then we, as you said, we were discussing the other potential cleanup ordinance changes. And so we had talked a little bit about drive-in, drive-through, curbside delivery. And we were about to start talking about zoning when we got cut off. So the nutshell version of the zoning is that we had, as council is aware, we were kind of comparing what the legislation in the ballot measure is to the 2016 legislation that was developed internally at the city and approved by city council back then, but never took effect. And so in terms of zoning, the 2016 legislation was actually much more open, and it's different zones for different types of uses, but to keep it simple, we'll talk about retail facilities. Those would have been allowed in general industrial, light industrial, and general commercial. And under the ballot measure language, they are only allowed in general industrial, but there's an exception for one particular property in light industrial where there's currently a medical marijuana facility, where they would be allowed on basically that one property and in general industrial. So I imagine that council would like to have some discussion about zoning, whether to make any changes about zoning, and specifically about the it's kind of like grandfathering, but not really, of the existing location. I see Councilor Rosner's got his hand up already.
And I'm asking this question for anyone who may watch this broadcast. If I understood you correctly, the actual measure that was passed included in a provision to basically grandfather in that location, even though it's not on currently industrial zoned land.
It's light industrial zone, not general industrial zone. So yeah, it's grandfathering is kind of a term of art, but more or less, yes, it's going to be allowed on that property and in general industrial.
But not not on any light industrial town.
No other light industrial other than that one light industrial property. Correct.
So it's an exception, basically.
Yes. There you go. So Councilor Griffin's got his hand up.
Yeah.
Literally and figuratively.
So, Julian, does it make sense? I mean, I think it kind of makes sense to remove it as a listed exception and maybe treat it as a non-conforming use. And then I don't know what the triggering event would be. I mean, it does say in there something about if the property is ever sold. But I think, what do you think about that? A period of non-use, because that way it just fades into the sunset if the new location in a general industrial zone is found. I don't know. We generally don't like to list something so specific as that. What's your take on that?
So right now, the way the legislation is worded, it would be allowed. Trying to answer your question. If you, right now there's not a retail use there. So they couldn't locate a retail use there until this takes effect and they apply and go through the process. If they are a retail use and that use weren't allowed anymore, they would basically be pre-existing non-conforming. And we've got code for that. That's a pre-existing non-conforming use, and really, for the most part, it's allowed to be there unless they stop operating for 6 months or more. It doesn't matter about change of ownership. There's restrictions on, you can't increase it, you can't alter the location and things like that. But change of ownership is not one of those things in our non-conforming use standards. Yeah, I guess that's the answer to your question. I mean, but they couldn't, if it wasn't allowed in any light industrial zone in our code, I mean, if that were to change, they wouldn't be able to be there as a retail use. They would be able to continue being a medical facility.
Right. So I mean, what I'm saying is, do we take out the very specific example, or do we just treat it as use the other R of the code, non-conforming? Is that part of the cleanup?
So again, I guess I think I understand your question, but they're not non-conforming yet. They're not
right, that's
there.
True. Yeah.
So yeah, if you take it out, they're not allowed. If you
Right.
take it out after they're there, then it's non-conforming.
Right. So and if you don't do that, then even if that property were changed to some completely different use for 10 years, and then 10 years from now somebody comes down the road and says they want to put a recreational marijuana retailer there, they would be allowed to.
And that's
if you don't make any changes, because it's called out as a specific exception. It's almost like spot zoning.
right. Well, that's what I was worried about.
Right.
That's what I was.
That's where my concern comes in, because I mean, from my perspective, I would like to keep the voters have spoken. We're going to allow it in Sherwood. That's not an issue, but I would like to keep it away from our retail centers, our homes, and our parks and our schools. Long term, I don't want that to be an exception that's on the books for 40 years. I think the example Josh used is with other for 10 years.
Tim, you're cutting in and out.
Yeah, Keith is making noise.
Yeah, we need some. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Anyways, that's kind of where my head was. If it's a non-conforming use, then they're still grandfathered in. But if they choose to switch locations down the road, or it changes to another use, I wouldn't necessarily want that to continue being an accepted use on that property. Because it is within, I think I measured it on Google Maps, it's about door to door, it's about 700 feet from Walmart right now.
Josh, if that business got sold and they're non-conforming, if we made it non-conforming, can the new owners operate?
Yes, I don't believe, Julia, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe there's anything about change in ownership triggering any changes as far as non-conforming uses in our code.
That's correct.
Yeah. But there's provisions about not being able to expand the use, the non-conforming use, if there's a period of non-use, for example, also.
Is
Can
there
that be changed in our code?
The non-conforming use section?
Yeah, as far as transfer of ownership.
Potentially, but then you're affecting every other potential non-conforming use.
Oh.
I mean, and that's pretty standard in the planning world as far as non-conforming uses and structures and things like that. But
okay.
You could change it, but then there could be unintended
Ramifications.
consequences.
Gotcha. Okay.
Unless you went to the granular detail of non-conforming only for this category. I don't know. Just thinking out loud.
So I guess I'm hearing maybe some different ideas about what triggers non-conforming uses having to come into conformance, but I haven't heard anybody who is advocating for keeping an exception on this particular property in perpetuity. Does anybody feel that this exception for this property should continue in perpetuity, as opposed to making it into a non-conforming use? Either way, it would be allowed, assuming that they get approval before we make this change, which I expect that they will. It would be allowed. It would be grandfathered, more or less, but it wouldn't be a exception in perpetuity.
You know, my feeling is that for me, it's more of a simplification, cleanup of the code. You know, and to have that very specific property listed in our code seems a little narrow. I'd rather have it, you know, and it's not to drive it out or make changes. I just think that's a more efficient way to handle the situation. I don't want to get into the habit of listing properties specifically when I'm sure this is not going to be a thing, but that's my feeling on that particular item.
And really, Councilor Griffin, I think kind of to your point, there's not really another way that they could have done it at a ballot measure level to make it allowed on this property, because it's not an existing use. It can be a non-conforming use.
Right.
But if we allow this language to go into effect and they get their approvals, and then we remove that exception, then it becomes a non-conforming use. Okay.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions on the subject of zoning in general? Is council generally happy with the idea of it being limited to general industrial?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry,
Silence is agreement.
Okay. So I'm gonna guess I know the answer to the next question, but there's also in the sections pertaining specifically to this one particular property, there's an exception in perpetuity for site planning review for that property. I'm imagining, based on the prior discussion, that council wouldn't want that to continue forever either. That'd be something we could maybe the exception stays for now because it's already an existing use that's not really changing substantially, but there's no need to exempt it from site planning if they were to make changes in the future, right?
I agree.
Okay.
You know, and so being just to beat the whatever, if they came in and they wanted to replace the structure, and they're a non-conforming use when they wanted to replace the structure, would that be allowed?
So
what level of remodel or replacement?
So and I'd have to look, it's the use that's non-conforming, and the use that is being exempted from the site plan criteria. If they were rebuilding a new building and that building was in the same place and no larger than their current facility, that use would be continuing to be non-conforming, but they would have to go through the process. I mean, I don't think it would happen like that where they would build the exact same building. You know, we'd have to look at it, but essentially they could rebuild a building going through the site plan review process, but the use is still non-conforming as long as they don't stop doing it for 6 months or more, or alter the building in a way that is making it bigger or in a different location.
Right, and it's a little more than just, I mean, it's generally going to be size, but it's that what the factor is, it's the adverse impact on surrounding properties or increasing the nonconformity. So they could look at other factors like, you know, noise and smells and that sort of thing. If the structure were the same size, but we're going to not have a ventilation system that the other one had, for example, potentially.
Right. Yeah. And I guess that's my point, is that it's the use that's non-conforming. The structure has to conform. So And I'm just from the non-conforming use section, it says no such use shall be enlarged, increased, or extended to occupy a greater area of land or space than was occupied at the effective date of adoption of the amendment of this code. So yeah, so it could potentially be a new building, but that building has to comply with whatever standards are in effect at the time.
Okay.
Okay. So then the last question I had, and then of course we can open it up to any questions that anybody else has, but many years ago, council adopted regulations for medical marijuana facilities that are pretty similar, I think, to the 2016 recreational facility language, probably closer to that than they are to this ballot measure language. Does it make sense to treat those two uses differently? Or should we conform the medical marijuana facilities regulations to align with the recreational marijuana facilities regulations? And just for what it's worth, it's mostly an intellectual exercise. There are not very many medical marijuana facilities left in the state of Oregon. I believe that there are 2 dispensaries left, and one of them is in Sherwood. So there'll soon be one. But just for consistency's sake, does it make sense to just mirror that language?
By law, do we have to retain that as a permitted use?
I believe, yes. So the statute that relates to prohibiting recreational facilities also applies to medical facilities, so that would have to be voter approved to prohibit those. So if you want to remove those as an allowable use, that would have to go to the voters.
I definitely would be in favor of one streamlined set of code for both.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree.
They should just be the same. But it's just in general, just general industrial.
Right. Yeah, it'd be all the same distances and zones and hours of operation, everything like that. Okay, that makes sense. That's all I had. Does anybody else have any other issues that they wanted to discuss or any questions?
Josh, so distances, if someone locates in a general industrial, is there and I should have reviewed it, but I'm not, just off the top of my head, is there a minimum distance that two stores have to be from each other?
I believe it's 1,000 feet, but I'm going to pull that up here and verify.
Sounds right.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah,
Other
that's what I
retail
wanted to ask.
facilities within 1,000 feet.
And do we have any issue with Tualatin and their limitations? Because don't they have a greater one? Isn't theirs like 3,000? Or would that cross city lines? Like if they had one just on the other side of the Sherwood line from us, does that impede us in any way? Or is there any impact at all? I don't know how that works.
That's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
That is a really interesting question.
So like if Tualatin have one right against the division line.
Yeah, exactly where our industrial area is.
So I think the literal reading of the code right now would be that it's 1,000 feet from any other recreational marijuana facility. Would not matter whether it's in city limits or outside city limits.
So we would be beholden to the 1,000 feet limit at that point. We wouldn't have to. We're not beholden to the 3,000. But if someone in Sherwood built one on the property or on the city limit line, then presumably if someone in Tualatin wanted to build one later, they would have to go 3,000 feet down the road.
Depending on how their code read, yeah.
Right, if theirs reads the same way.
So I would. Is there logic to have I would only have any distance issues within the city limits, not. It would be my first blush at it, and then won't competition pretty much prevent another one from happening?
That would be that's probably the more realistic question is
why do we even need to have the distance limiter?
Yeah, because I think what you're looking at is 1,000 feet from the existing shop is going to push it into the far corner of the current industrial zone, anyways, near that border. And to your point, Keith, and to allay some of the fears that I've seen online, we're not going to have a shop every 1,000 feet in Sherwood, even though that by the rules we could have, several of them lined up in the industrial area. Market would not probably dictate that we would have more than one, I would think. So
Yes, I think that the 1,000-foot spread rules were very popular early on after Measure 91 passed, when these things were popping up all over everywhere. That's slowed down a lot now, but I think that people were concerned that you're going to have one on every corner, more or less, and that, like Councilor Garland said, I don't think the market supports that.
Well, and the current one that will transition over sort of has I don't know if you call it an unfair advantage, but definitely an advantage of being on 99. They kind of have a prime location right there, and whether somebody else would even come.
With the two city issue, I was just looking at Google Maps and measuring if one did go into effect on the other side of 124th on 12th and Sherwood, 3,000 feet is Oregon Street, so you still would have plenty of room between Oregon Street and Rock Creek, which is 1,000 feet from the current location, for a facility to go in. So I'm not too worried about it.
It's certainly probably a moot point, to Keith's point, that Sherwood is not going to become the hotbed of marijuana shops in the region, but I think it's just an interesting thing to look at, just in case.
Yeah.
Is there any? I think the 2016 ordinance had additional rules around distance from other types of locations within Sherwood. Do we have any now? And if not, what should we add?
Yes, so we have 1,000 feet of a school, which is defined, and 1,000 feet of a public plaza or active use park, which is also defined.
I'm not. I think those are great. I'm not terribly worried about distance between these type of businesses. I think, the nature of competition will keep the numbers low, but whatever the will of council, I'm supportive of.
My only add would be, if there's a way to put it in, is within 1,000 feet of our retail centers.
Yeah, that's there already, right?
Yep.
No, it's not.
Okay.
I don't think retail.
1,000 feet of another
1,000
retail
feet of another
facility.
retail facility, like a recreational marijuana retail facility, not any retail facility.
I think Tim is talking about any commercial
Right.
zone.
Like I'm talking about, like the Walmart Center, the Target Center, where because our kids hang out there. That's the way I look at it. So
Julia and I can discuss offline how to define that, but we can come up with some language to that effect.
Did we discuss hours? I know we discussed hours of operations, but did we discuss, what they're proposing? We're going to take that out of the code and put it into a resolution, but did we talk about what that might look like, or is that for a later date?
I don't remember talking about it.
We're going to take it out of the land use code and put it into the general recreational marijuana facilities code, so it can be amended without having to go through the land use code process, but it would still be an ordinance, so that it can be, an effective law. But we didn't know. I don't think we had much conversation about whether you want to make changes to what those hours are.
Do we have any ordinance that affects the hours of operation for our liquor stores in town? Because they currently close at 8 o'clock, I believe.
I believe that may just be their own hours or OLCC regulations. I have not seen anything in our code about that.
It's not OLCC required. They have the OLCC regulations require liquor stores to be open at least 6 hours a day. They can't open before, I think it's 8 a.m. at the earliest, and they can't close later than 10 p.m. So it appears to be a local choice on that front.
And it looks like ours close at 7:30 Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then 8 p.m. on Fridays and Saturdays, and 12 to 5 on Sundays. At least that's what Google says.
So really, the hours that were proposed in 2016 and the hours in this ballot measure are almost the same. It's 10 a.m. to 8 p.m., except that this measure allows 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. on Fridays and Saturdays. So it's only different on Fridays and Saturdays.
That 2 extra hours is what is giving me concern. I would be in favor of the 8 p.m. every day personally.
Chief, do you have any thoughts on that from a law enforcement point of view?
I really don't have any concerns about the hours. I don't anticipate any problems.
Shouldn't hours kind of mirror liquor store?
Are you asking me, Mayor?
Yeah, and council.
Well, I mean, from a consistency perspective, it would certainly be an easy way, just to mirror the hours across the board for similar type of establishments. So
I remember when we put this ordinance together when the first time around that was a huge conversation. And if I remember correct, Joe, isn't that why we structured it until 8 o'clock? Was to be more in line?
I think there was a lot of concern because it was brand new.
Yeah.
And I think, Chief Growth and I have talked about the experience. I think, Chief, you can speak for yourself, but you said, you have changed your mind a little bit. You expected these potentially to be more problematic than they've had over the last few years in terms of problems. And is that a correct assumption?
Yes.
Is that what I heard?
Well, I think your assessment is correct. When we had this conversation several years ago, we didn't have any history to go on, and it was all speculation. And we now have, even locally, we have a small amount of history to go on, and it's really no history, right? What I mean by that is there haven't been any issues or trouble. So there's really no basis for me to have any concern based on what we've experienced.
Are the hours that they're proposing different than what they've been operating? A couple hours later on weekends?
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head what the medical marijuana facility hours are, so I don't know that I can answer that. My guess is yes, but
I mean, the one thing that comes to mind that is always a concern is this is still a cash business, and the potential for robbery or somebody, because it's open later in the evenings, could be a risk that we might want to think about. It's not like a normal business yet for federal reasons that these places still have a lot of cash. So that would be my biggest concern.
And looking online, the one in King City, if it's correct, it's called Leafly. It's on 116th Avenue. It's open 7 a.m. till 10 p.m. 7 days a week.
Okay.
Wow.
So if I can just add, those are good points about the cash business. The difference from my perspective between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. from a crime perspective and robbery is fairly insignificant. If we were talking about 8 p.m. till midnight, then that's a wholly different story. Certainly the biggest issues we're going to have relative to behavioral problems are going to be after midnight, right? So bars open until 2 in the morning or so on and so forth. But when the liquor stores are closing at 8 or 10 o'clock, recreational marijuana facility, if it closes at 10 o'clock, I would certainly not be comfortable any later than that, but I just really don't have any basis to think that 2 hour period is going to cause a spike in crime. There's still a fairly significant amount of traffic and activity depending on the time of year and the day of the week at 10 o'clock in Sherwood. There's a lot of cars driving around, and so it's not like you're going to be you're not going to have the cover of darkness and seclusion and those kinds of things like you would another 2 hours later. So
and that facility is required to have cameras and lighting as well, right, as part of the guidance.
That's correct. I mean, and I recall that was part of the conversation a few years ago, was that the security systems that are required, and they're, let's face it, from an investment perspective, they don't want to lose their money. They don't want to get ripped off. So they're going to invest in, the experience has been that they make pretty good investments in security. Now, obviously, I've not done a security assessment, so I can't tell you exactly what is there, but that was the general thought then, and I think it's probably accurate now.
And I don't know what kind of protocols they have in place or other facilities have in place, but having in my younger days worked at fast food restaurants where you close at late night hours, you would generally have a type of protocol where people would accompany each other out of the store at the same time, and anybody who's walking with a bag, that's a bank deposit, is usually not walking alone. So I know that doesn't preclude crime, but it certainly would deter it, I would imagine. So this, as you've said, Chief, they've been doing this for years now, and we haven't seen significant crime. So I'm not terribly concerned about the 10 o'clock time period. I'd be advocating to leave it as is and let the store dictate whether they want to close at 8 or want to close at 10.
So just another point of comparison, Chalice Farms, which is up the street in Tigard, is 8 a.m. to 9:30 every day, 7 days a week. In terms of,
I think it sounds like our hours are reasonable then.
So I had a follow up on that. Do you see any, Chief? Do you see any difference in the rates of people driving impaired between 8 and 10, or is it really not heat up until later?
Yeah, that's a good question, and no, it's what we would call prime time, which obviously from a negative perspective is much later than 10 o'clock. You certainly have the ability to arrest a drunk driver at 10 in the morning, 10 at night, or 3 in the morning. But just from a statistical perspective, that's between 8 and 10 is really not when we see the majority of those arrests. It's after midnight. It's closer to the release time at bars, or before that if people need to travel a little bit to get home, or whatever the case may be.
So as a follow-up to that, since the legalization, I guess it's been 4 years now, have we seen any change at all in the rates of driving under the impairment of marijuana?
No, not enough to where I can provide you anything more than a little anecdotal information that I think it may be more common to encounter people who have used marijuana, but of course the issues that we brought up back then are in fact still in play today, and that is that it stays in your system so long that the testing and the measuring process is challenging, in particular from a roadside perspective, right? When you're trying to measure roadside impairment, by far and away, alcohol is the bigger culprit when we're talking about impaired drivers that we've encountered.
Thank you.
So this is Tim. Can we move on, or did you need more on this, Josh?
I've got everything I need. So unless others have things that they want to discuss,
real quick, can we go back to the drive up or drive through issue? Can you read back what we talked? I'm trying to remember where we landed on that specifically.
That's a good point. I don't know that we reached a consensus on that one.
So maybe a little more conversation on that.
Yep.
I know early on in the COVID epidemic, we made statewide, we made a lot of accommodations for businesses to do drive up that didn't traditionally do it. I'm just wondering, is that still something we want to do now, and do we need to do that with this particular location, especially given that it's all cash business? And so when you have cash changing hands at a car window or something like that, is that an issue?
Well, there's also the ID issue.
So I guess my 2 cents as someone that implements the code is if it's something that's special because of COVID, I wouldn't put that in the code. I think that there's other ways that you could address those special circumstances than putting something in the code for hopefully a short-term issue.
I thought that's what we talked about. We talked about not allowing the curbside pickup. However, during COVID, we could address that during one or through the emergency order.
Are we during COVID? Are we allowing curbside pickup for alcohol?
Well, I think that OLCC has. I mean, I think bars and restaurants are able to sell alcohol in ways that they normally aren't able to. So I assume so.
I guess I was thinking more of the liquor store, but that's a good point you made.
And I don't know, because I haven't reached out to the owners of the current medical. I don't know if there's a need to do anything different during COVID because of the uniqueness of the business.
So one thing I want to point out here, the language in the ballot measure says that drive up, drive through, curbside is only allowed to the extent permitted by OLCC. It doesn't say it's allowed or not allowed. It's deferring to OLCC. And I remembered something, so I was just searching here, and it looks like OLCC does not allow drive up, drive through, or curbside recreational marijuana, but they made an exception during COVID. I imagine they probably have done the same thing for liquor stores. I don't know, but they are allowing an exception during COVID, but generally do not allow.
But having that language would, for in the future, if they changed it and did begin to allow it, this language would then allow it.
Yeah, which I want our language in our code to state that it's not allowed. If I have enough agreement.
Is there a reason specifically on that?
I don't think it should be anything different than a liquor store, and I don't want to be Louisiana.
Exactly, and I think a restaurant selling liquor is very different from a liquor store selling it, because I think it'd be different if you had restaurants selling this stuff, but I worry about cash transactions in the parking lot.
Minors,
yeah, I just think it's a bad idea.
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, Chief.
I just confirmed what Josh thought, and that is that curbside is allowed temporarily. OLCC back in March passed a temporary rule as part of COVID to allow that to happen. So, but it's just temporary, and they're very clear that it's just part of COVID. So I just want to confirm that.
Yeah.
And I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
Right.
And I'm not certainly advocating for it either. I'm just trying to figure out the thinking behind this. I think traditionally these establishments have always been, you walk in, and that's been part of their security measures, is that they're checking IDs before anybody walks in to ensure that everyone who walks in has a license and is 21. So I don't think that the current owners or any future owners would push very hard for this. I'm speculating, but yeah, I was just trying to figure out the reason why.
Then if that's the case, then they wouldn't object to it being in the code.
No, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, I don't have any objection to it either. I'm just trying to see all sides of this one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Trying to future-proof.
Yeah, so we can easily do that, prohibit them, and I think we could just rely on our general emergency code to allow them to happen during COVID, as we've done with a number of other things. Well, I'll verify that. We shouldn't need to put an exception in this section.
It sounds like they can do it just through OLCC's ruling. Do we have to do something special?
Well, if we don't allow it under our own local code, even if OLCC allows it, it would not be allowed in Sherwood unless we took action to allow it.
And are we in agreement that we would allow it during this time? That we wouldn't put any undue burden on this one establishment?
No, I'm fine in COVID. I think we
Okay.
need to help all of our businesses during COVID.
Okay.
I agree with that. I would want to, we should not allow it in general times in case OLCC changes the rules down the road, so we can have that conversation at that point.
Yeah, and I don't think do we have the authority over booze? I don't think we do. I mean, I wouldn't want to have a drive-through liquor establishment either.
When I was 20 living in Mississippi, I enjoyed the drive-throughs.
You wanted your daiquiris.
The drinking age was 18 at that time.
Yep. He had a drive-through in Ann Arbor too.
Yep.
Send
Duluth,
through one in
Minnesota.
Wyoming.
Yep.
Oregon, Ohio.
They would actually give you a mixed drink into the window.
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
So, like, drinking and driving was okay there?
Oh yeah.
Open container is allowed in a handful of states. That is for sure.
Crazy.
It was.
Speaking
Not
of
supposed
Ann
to
Arbor,
drink it.
Josh,
No, we're not talking about that. Not talking about football. Not this season.
it's a good thing for you.
Yes.
Hey, Josh, do we need to talk about timing of the ordinance? I know you have a whole section in your email about that.
Yeah,
The
so
gap.
I think the gap is really only an issue if we were not going in the direction that we're talking about, which is allow this facility, the existing facility, to get all of its approvals, then remove what would have allowed that, so that it becomes a non-conforming use. So we'll move this forward as quickly as possible, but there's no need to try to get it done before January 1st.
Okay. That's good.
All right.
All right. Unless there's anything else, I think we're done here.
Good meeting.
Anything else? 40 minutes. Done.
Very good. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Bye,
Enjoy
guys.
the rain for the next week and the wind and all that good stuff.
Good night.